Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. And I'm delighted to be joined again by Bret Devereaux and to continue his masterclass on Lord of the Rings and how it can help us think about ancient and medieval history. So welcome back, Bret.
Great to be back.
Last time we talked about Helm's Deep, and this time we're moving on to the Siege of Gondor. And at the end of our previous show, we left Saruman sitting in the ruins of Isengard, and I guess that serves him right because he was a bad man with a bad plan, and he executed it badly. Actually, I say Saruman's a bad man, but is he a man? What are the wizards in Lord of the Rings?
Right, yeah, he's not quite a man. So the Istari, the wizards in the Lord of the Rings, they are Maiar. So they are the Middle Earth's equivalent almost of angels. They're semi-divine spirits. There are, we find out, right, Saruman tells us that there are 5 of them, that there are 5, because he says the rods of the 5 wizards, and this is the point where we learn that there are apparently 5 of them. We only meet 3 of them in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien, in his unfinished tales and in his letters, has contradictory stories about what happens to the other 2. But they are essentially semi-divine beings that are inhabiting a human form. And their mandate seems to be to oppose, this comes out of the Silmarillion, to oppose the will and works of Sauron, not by directly opposing power with power, but by inciting the free peoples of Middle-earth to great deeds. And Gandalf is really the only one that fulfills this mandate. Radagast, who we meet earlier, essentially gets distracted by how wondrous nature is and doesn't quite do his job, although he isn't quite a bad Maiar either. And Saruman, obviously overcome with a mix of pride and fear. And there's more of this. Saruman's fall is more detailed in the unfinished tales. There's a whole section on it that, he is both afraid of Sauron, but also in studying his works comes to kind of admire him. And it's striking that all of the Maiar are generally, each of them serves one of the more or less gods of Tolkien's setting of Middle-earth, the Valar. And it's striking that, if I'm remembering correctly, both Sauron and Saruman are servants of Aule, the craftsman god. And so they both have this kind of mind of gears and wheels. And consequently, Saruman comes to sort of understand in a bad way and admire in a worse way what Sauron is doing. And he has that same inchoate desire, which he expresses to Gandalf in this sort of final parley in the books. This doesn't come out in the films very well, that he wants to sort of set the world to order. And the real problem is that these dumb humans keep making dumb decisions. And if only we could set things right. And Gandalf, who as a Maiar was Olorin, was famous for being the wisest of the Maiar, and he is close to wisdom personified in this setting, is smart enough to recognize that that is a dumb idea and that it leads to nowhere good. And so he, quite wisely, he offers Saruman the opportunity to take the wise course, and Saruman, in his folly, does not. I'd encourage readers of The Lord of the Rings, as a side note, just it's such a deep and rich world. Try reading it, taking special note of what Gandalf says, and you can observe that Gandalf never lies, and he is never wrong. Through pretty much the whole text, there may be weird exceptions, but he is wisdom personified. And when he makes unequivocal statements, he is basically always correct. And I can think of no instance where he lies directly. And he has a mind for wisdom. He calls Saruman a fool, and he doesn't do this lightly. When Frodo complains about the folly of Barliman Butterbeer, the innkeeper in Bree, Gandalf springs up to correct him. That no, he is not a fool. He is a touch slow. But I think Gandalf's phrasing is that he could stare his way through a solid wall if given enough time. That Gandalf is quick to correct that he's not a fool. He's forgetful. And not perhaps the sharpest knife in the drawer, but intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Saruman is clearly extremely intelligent and very foolish.
Let's move on to somebody who's also perhaps intelligent, and I don't know whether foolish or not, but let's talk about the Witch King. What's he planning for Gondor?
Right. The Witch King, I think, is a wonderful contrast in the work in some ways to Saruman, in that we kind of talked about last time. Saruman's attack on Helm's Deep is a sort of amateur hour effort. A lot of things aren't planned very well. The whole thing isn't put together very well. It's not prepared very well. The Witch King as an adversary clearly knows his business a lot better. And if you get into the lore of the universe, there's no surprise here because he's been doing it for a lot longer in that he's been waging war a lot. Like Saruman is obviously much older, but Saruman hasn't been doing very much war in his existence as a Maya. But the Witch King has been doing this for a long time. And so his ducks are in a row. And I think this gets expressed very well, sort of transitioning to the military history analysis from the literary analysis. It gets expressed really well in the fact that the Witch King has a really tricky operational problem. And that he has a very large army, which he needs to move over a considerable distance where supplies are not guaranteed. And then he needs to lay siege to an almost comically over-fortified city.
Yes.
And he needs to take it. And the problem that he's running into here is what is historical analysis we call logistics, the problem of supplying, feeding, and moving armies. And the layer of military analysis for this is operations. People may be very familiar with strategy, which is the big picture. Why am I fighting this war? What do I want out of it? And tactics, the sort of very small picture. How do I fight? Operations is the middle layer of analysis that concerns things like where do you fight and how do you move armies? And the operational problem the Witch King has is considerable. He needs a huge army in order to be victorious. But of course, a huge army has huge demands in food and supplies. It moves slowly. And so he has to get it from point A to point B. The films kind of bungle this, in that the films present the whole army just sort of streams out of Minas Morgul in one big line down a single road on its way in. And I do, in the blog post right at the beginning, if folks want to read it, I calculate out that his army would be 30 miles long. Given the rate at which armies move, the front of the army would be making camp for the evening before the back of the army had left Minas Morgul. This is an army that could not move together. It would move 0 miles a day. It is too large. And so in the film, this sort of doesn't make a lot of sense. What I like in the books is if you parse all of the things that people are saying sometimes in the background, you realize that the book version of the Witch King's campaign is much more complex. That he's actually moving several different armies. They have different objectives. He is crossing the River Anduin in 2 different places, along with having a fleet that is going to ideally shadow him on his way up. It gets waylaid. We can talk about that later.
I'm sure we will.
It gets waylaid by the dead, something he couldn't have really anticipated. Splitting up the army makes his logistics problem easier. It allows him to move across different supply depots that he's probably set up. It allows him to draw potentially to forage supplies from different areas as he moves. And of course, smaller armies can move faster. And so by breaking his army up in the books really into multiple discrete units, because he has the forward orc force that crosses at Osgiliath, a second force also made of orcs that crosses at Caer Andros, a third force made of the men of Rune and Harad, which is clearly coming in behind these 2 forces, and the fleet. So he split his army into 4 discrete groups in order to enable it to be possible for them to get to the objective. We can imagine this army splitting up over possibly dozens of different roadways, moving in lots of discrete groups. And then, of course, the tricky problem is you need all of these guys to depart at roughly the same time and arrive at exactly the same time. And he has to coordinate this, not only the movement of men and orcs and trolls, but the movement of catapults and towers and ships and supplies, which all need to be moved. And we can see that the Witch King is really quite masterful at this, that everything arrives on schedule, that it arrives on time, that he has a blocking force in his fleet to block relief forces coming from the south from Gondor. He actually has a blocking force on the road to Rohan, which is circumvented in the event, but I don't think he could have planned for that. So it's a very intricate campaign that he is launching on a very large scale that he is quite expertly deploying. And so if we want to say sort of what is his strategy, his plan, right, the main problem the Witch King has is how I have overwhelming force. How do I deliver overwhelming force at the decisive point? And he has developed a fairly complex plan that he then executes admirably well in order to deliver that overwhelming force to the point. And he does. He delivers it. I talk about in the series how in pre-modern agrarian warfare, your target generally are urban centers, are cities, and the question that you're looking for is how to, the phrase I use, which I borrowed from Wayne Lee, one of my dissertation advisors, is deliver the siege. The Witch King is looking at a very tricky problem to deliver that siege, and he nevertheless delivers a really massive siege quite expertly.
What I'd like to have you talk about a little bit is that he has this massive army, and okay, it's maybe come from 4 different directions and it's been split up along the way in different roads, so it gets there, it can move that bit faster, but once it's there, it has to eat, doesn't it?
Yes, right. And so the clock is ticking. So the tricky part, this gets into pre-modern logistics, the tricky part, assuming you don't have naval supply, and again, any naval supply he had is disrupted by Aragorn and the Army of the Dead. Any way you move food in the ancient world, and the main form of supply your army needs for an ancient or medieval army is food. Any way you move food also eats food. And so this imposes a sort of tyranny. If you talk to rocket engineers, they'll talk about the rocket equation. The problem with a rocket is that you have to lift all of your fuel into the air. And every bit of fuel you want to take to space, you first have to lift it off the ground. And so most of the weight of your rocket is fuel that's only job is to lift other bits of fuel. And you run into the same problem where over distance, if you load up a cart with food and you begin moving it in the direction of your army, well, the guy driving the cart and the horses pulling the cart are eating the food in the cart. After a certain distance, they've eaten most of the food in the cart. And so your throughput of supplies to your army exponentially shrink. And as a result, armies, instead of maintaining modern style supply lines that stretch back to supply depots back in the home country, they tend to need to get their food mostly locally because they can't move it very far. Because again, the further you move it, the more it gets eaten. The usual estimate is that the cost of any given amount of grain doubles every 100 miles moving over land. So your transport costs get prohibitively expensive very, very fast. Since your army is very large, it's going to hoover up all the food in the countryside very rapidly, with the result that most armies are, the metaphor I use is they are like sharks. If they do not swim, they will sink.
Yeah.
And so for the Witch King, his army is way too large to be supported locally in Gondor. So it has the supplies it has left with that it can carry, and that's it. And so what it has essentially is he has a ticking clock. From the moment he steps off, there is a hard time limit, probably around 10 to 15 days. That's about how much food supply you can move with an army of any size. You're pretty much capped out around 10 days. And I walk through the math of how that works, that he essentially has a limited amount of time to get this job done, which is part of why his attack is so aggressive. He isn't settling in for a siege. He isn't going to wait them out. He isn't going to try and starve the city outright. He gets there. We're going to set up catapults. We're going to set up towers. We're going to get our ram. We're going to go in. He attacks the night after he arrives because he has already burned multiple days getting there. He potentially is going to have to burn multiple days after he takes the city, redispersing his army so that it's once again dispersed enough that it can survive off of local food supplies. So he is on the clock, which makes this operation even trickier. And also, again, explains why he has to be so aggressive, why he can't just wait and take a defensive posture when things start to go wrong. He has to stay aggressive because otherwise his army is going to starve in the field. He is at the end, we would say, he is at the edge of his logistical tether. And
other generals in history, I'm thinking about people like Caesar. They're sort of renowned for being at the end of their logistical tether, if you like. And indeed, at one stage, when he's fighting Pompey, famously, his men are reduced to pretty much eating grass at one stage.
Right. He ends up having to force a battle at Pharsalus because he's out of time. And he has to force the battle on what are essentially unfavorable terms. I mean, in the end, the experience of his legions, the fact that his soldiers are just much more experienced, ends up carrying the day for him. I think you'd see this actually very clearly if you contrast Caesar with his protege, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony. They both have this same sort of tendency to seemingly look before they leap on a logistical basis and then make it up as they go along, I think you can see the real difference in the quality of them, in that for Caesar, it always works out. He takes these bold, aggressive, audacious moves. He gets into real trouble at Pharsalus. That's really the realest trouble he ever gets into. And so it looks like he's looking before he leaps, and yet, like the squirrel, he always lands on the branch. And at some point, that's not luck. That's planning.
Yeah.
Antony seems to have learned the lesson of audacity. He frequently misses the branch. He doesn't have that same planning. And so at Philippi, right, Antony and Octavian fighting Brutus and Cassius, they're very clearly, Plutarch and Appian tell us this, that the Antony and Octavian's armies are, again, running to the edge of their logistical tether, and all Brutus and Cassius need to do is wait it out. But that becomes politically impossible. Their allies want a decisive battle, so they get suckered into a battle that they lose at Philippi. It was dumb. They shouldn't have fought. And so Antony lucks out. He's going to go straight from that to a campaign against the Parthians, where he's going to try the same trick of being very bold and audacious, and the Parthians are better commanders than Brutus and Cassius, and so they carve up his army pretty badly. He has to slink back out of Persia somewhat humiliated, and then he goes into his war with Octavian, the Actium campaign, and again, he leaps before he looks, and he gets all the way up the west coast of Greece to Actium, and this time, Octavian's the one with a better military commander, which is not Octavian. He was not a good military commander, and by this point, he had learned that. He knew it. He had a fellow, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who was a better military commander, and Agrippa quite masterfully recognizes that Antony has been very bold and played a very risky hand, and so he just bottles him up. He takes his superior fleet, blocks Antony's naval supply, sits on the opposite end of a body of water, and waits for Antony's army to wither on the vine, which it promptly does. Antony is defeated, flees back to Egypt, commits suicide, and so you can see this sort of contrast. In some ways, I would say the Witch King looks more like a Julius Caesar. He's taking this bold, aggressive action, but it should play out. And he even has contingencies, unlike Saruman, right, who had no contingencies for when things go wrong. Any individual part of the Witch King's plan can fall apart, and the rest of the plan will continue going, and he'll still win. What ends up happening is that all of the individual pieces fail for reasons relatively out of his control. Saruman botches the campaign in the north, so Rohan shows up. He planned for that. He has a blocking force to stop them from showing up. But they circumvent his blocking force through the clever use of local guides, which we can come back to. But that wouldn't have been fatal because he has this fleet blocking other reinforcements, but then it's defeated by an army of the dead, which he also really couldn't have planned for.
No.
And so even then, as his forces from Rune and Harad come up, even with his fleets out of commission and Rohan has arrived, it's a close-run thing. Theoden is killed. The Witch King falls on the battlefield because he misinterprets a prophecy. Bit of a whoopsies.
Yes. That's not the first time in history that's ever happened.
No. And so it's a close-run thing. And so, the Witch King ends up losing. But, I think you come away saying that he has done his job capably, even if it didn't turn out the way he wanted to. Of course, part of his problem is that the defense of Minas Tirith, particularly in the books, is carried out far more capably. And so he's not, in some ways, Denethor is a worse man, but a better general than Theoden.
Can we just talk a bit about that then? So how does Gondor try and make life difficult for the Witch King?
Right. So Gondor's strategy is what we would call a defense in depth. They're aware that they're weaker. Their army isn't as large and as strong. And so if they try and concentrate all of their army in one place at one point on the line, the Witch King will just beat them and they'll have lost. So their plan is instead, rather than one defensive line, they have a series of defensive lines that the Witch King has to push his way through. Again, the term for this is defense in depth. What they're trying to do is to make something that German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz calls friction their ally. I should shout out, because this is a running joke on the blog, we've invoked Clausewitz. Drink! Everybody take a drink! Friction is the tendency for any large collective enterprise, of which war is, of course, one, to steadily go a little bit wrong as it goes on. As armies move forward, right, units don't move quite as fast as you'd like them to. Battles don't turn out exactly the way you would expect. Someone is, having rather too good a lunch when they should be getting their soldiers moving. All of these little things start to go wrong the moment your army steps off at the beginning of an operation. And of course, in addition to that, the enemy is inflicting losses on you, which is also a form of friction. You're losing people as well. And so your force, your attacking force, is never stronger or more coherent than the moment before it steps off on the attack. And at every moment after that, it's growing weaker. Whether it's moving or fighting, it's getting weaker, it's tiring out, supplies are being used, wagon wheels get stuck and break, all of these things that go wrong. What a defense in depth does is the defender is able, through a defense in depth, to make that process of friction their ally. That as you force the enemy to move forward and to push through successive stages of defense, each stage is going to mess up their plan a little bit, is going to break a little bit more of their army, is going to sap a little bit more of their strength. And the idea is, therefore, that by the time the enemy is finally penetrated to your last line of defense, they are now sufficiently weak that you can oppose them, that you can counterattack, and then begin pushing them backwards because they have been exhausted by this process of friction. And so Gondor has essentially 4 defensive zones that they are defending. The outermost zone, really the Witch King's backyard, is in Ithilien. This is, in both the books and the films, this is where Faramir is hanging out initially with his rangers, doing what is essentially guerrilla warfare, doing little raids on the enemy. And so the first thing that the Witch King needs to do is he has to move through this area where he's potentially going to be subject to these rangers doing little raids and supply disruption. He has to clear through that area. When he moves out with his army, right, there's no effort to oppose his army in this area. That's not the point. The damage has been done by forcing him to scout his way through this area and to clear it. And so the rangers, they just retreat to the next line of defense rather than take losses. The next line is the Anduin River itself. There are 2 major crossings, Caer Andros in the north and Osgiliath in the south. They're both garrisoned and they're both defended. And what we see, and this is especially clear in the books, the movie makes something of a wreck of Gondor's operational plan. But in the books, this is very clear that they oppose the Witch King's crossing. They inflict casualties on him, but the moment he's across in force, the Gondorian forces at Osgiliath and at Caer Andros withdraw. They just immediately retreat. The moment he's over, they're like, okay, we've inflicted the losses we can. We've inflicted the friction we can. We're going to back up before we take losses. And the forces out there at the ford are all on horseback. So they just get up on their horses and they ride away. Bye-bye. To the next line of defense.
Yeah.
Which is now we get the large field around Minas Tirith. The Pelennor has, the Ramus Eckor has a large wall around all of it. And this is the next point where, so the forces from Caer Andros and from Osgiliath can now fall back to this outer wall. And it's not as strong as the inner walls of Minas Tirith itself, but it's one more problem that you have to deal with. You're going to have to punch through this wall, and you're going to have to punch through it at specific places, which means now your army is funneled, and you're going to have to get out of marching formation into fighting formation. And then by this point, you've had to do that multiple times, which is disruptive. And again, as soon as the Ramus Eckor is breached, Faramir and his forces fall back again, right? And this is the sort of very striking, their flight across the Pelennor, and they're getting chased by Nazgul and so on and so forth. Again, the movie puts this in a slightly different spot, but Tolkien has it make more sense. And indeed, by this point, the Witch King's vanguard, the front of his army, has gotten so strung out trying to chase these guys and trying to attack all of these things, inflicted casualties, that they are finally rendered vulnerable as they cross the Pelennor. And Denethor seizes the opportunity. He lets these guys overchase almost to the gates of Minas Tirith, and then he has Gondorian heavy cavalry countercharge them in the open field. Quite expertly. He waits until they're at the orcs are at their most vulnerable point, and then hits them and just rolls them all the way back. And then, of course, quickly, because he, knows the full enemy force isn't exhausted yet, he then retreats back again to the walls of Minas Tirith. And of course, Minas Tirith itself, with multiple concentric circles of walls, is itself a sort of defense-in-depth Matryoshka doll. And so what Denethor is doing is he is managing, and I think, he is cynical and callous in his management of this, but he's also quite expert in the book in his management of this in a way that he's quite foolish in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Things are moved around to make him a bit more of a dunderhead in the film, but in the books, he knows what he's doing. And he is quite expertly both exhausting the enemy and also delaying them. Because, of course, he knows that, one, the Witch King has a logistical ticking clock, and two, that reinforcements potentially from Rohan, potentially from the rest of Gondor, are likely to be on their way, and so time is his ally. And that's the other advantage of this defense-in-depth system, is the more time you force the enemy to waste, the more forces gather on your side and the rougher a position you can put them in. Now, in the case where you have two fairly expert military commanders, the defenses are well prepared. But of course, as with any static defense, the Witch King can see them. So he is prepared for every layer of the defense. He has prepared little armored covered boats to cross the river. That makes sense. He has prepared blasting fire, which is presumably something like gunpowder, to breach the Ramus Ekor. And he's prepared, I assume we'll talk about in a second, siege equipment to breach Minas Tirith. And so he has planned through each stage of this defense in depth, even as Denethor is working actively to make it as hard as possible to breach each stage. And we see, defense in depth is a very common historical defense system. We can see this, and I assume that this is where Tolkien is getting it. This becomes the standard way of setting up for trench warfare. That eventually the standard learned in bloody lessons over 1914 and 1915 that the way you have to set up your trenches is typically in 3 lines with a scout trench out in front, and then the main battle position is actually behind it, so that the enemy's artillery barrage falls on thinly manned scout trenches that you can afford to give up. And then reserve positions behind the main battle position, so that even if the enemy charges across no man's land, gets through your artillery and machine guns, gets into your initial trenches, pushes through, gets to your main battle trench, and even if they succeed there, all they've done is won the privilege of charging across no man's land one more time under all of your artillery, which of course almost never succeeds.
Mm-hmm.
And so this sort of defense in depth, and then of course once they're exhausted, once they are completely spent, it is an easy matter for you, your reserves moving across clear lines of transportation and communication in your rear. Remember, an army is never stronger than when it first steps off on the attack. Now you counterattack and easily retake all of your forward positions. And of course, that does happen at the end of the battle, that as Mordor's army begins to fall apart, we have Aragorn and the Rohirrim and the men of Gondor charge out of the city. They counterattack and they carry back all of the old defensive positions. And at the end of the battle, both sides are exactly where they started.
Mm. I was interested, you mentioned World War I in the context of what the men of Gondor are about. And I felt that you called Denethor callous, but he was extravagantly grief-stricken when his son, apparently he sent him to his death.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt, is that an echo from World War I? Because certainly the British ruling classes, if you like, they didn't spare their children in the First World War.
Right. I think it must be. And I think I said this last time, and I will say this again, and I will bang this drum until I die. The Lord of the Rings should be understood as a piece of World War I literature, like All Quiet on the Western Front or these other works, that it should be seen in this light. And so I do think that it does have echoes of this, that Denethor doesn't know his own mind. And Gandalf says as much when, Denethor acts like, oh, well, I'll spend even my sons. That Gandalf is telling Faramir, he loves you and he'll remember it before the end. That Denethor, in his despair, because by this point he has fallen into despair, he doesn't think he can win.
Well, that's partly because he's looked into the Palantir, and although
right,
it's showing him the truth, but it's only showing him part of the truth.
Part of the truth, yes. Yes, no, exactly. And so he's fallen, and in his despair, he's lost sight in some ways of what he himself values. I think there is a potent lesson in some ways that Denethor, like all of the countries involved in the First World War, to be honest, has become so trapped in the question of how do I win that he has in some cases forgotten what was important that he was fighting for in the first place and hasn't asked important questions about what victory looks like, and realizes only too late that a victory that spends his entire family isn't a victory for him.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a sort of, I think Denethor is somewhat of a villainous character in the films, but in the books, he is really a tragic character.
Yeah.
And, enmeshed in folly, he is making mistakes. He is being foolish, and Gandalf is trying to point out to him the mistakes he is making. They're not strategic mistakes. They're mistakes of moral wisdom.
His pride is killing him, and there's an interesting dynamic that they're the they're the stewards of Gondor.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite interesting, this idea of the regent and the king, and I guess that harks back to, I don't know, not so much to World War I, but maybe to the medieval times, or even to the sultans and the viziers. I don't know.
Right. No, and you do have this. What always springs to mind with me, with the sort of the stewards acting almost as kings, is how the Carolingian dynasty emerges in France.
Oh, really?
That, prior to Charles Martel, one of Charlemagne's ancestors, prior to Charles Martel, and I believe even Charles Martel himself is this, the Carolingians were not the kings. The Merovingians were the kings. The Carolingians were the mayors of the palace. The major domus, the major domo, the sort of head steward or chancellor, essentially, of the kings. And as Merovingian monarchs decided that, ruling isn't all that much fun, and they would rather just ignore it and leave it up to their stewards, the Carolingians take more and more of a direct role in running everything. Obviously, eventually usurp the throne. And it's evident that Denethor would kind of like that to happen, that he isn't super thrilled about Aragorn showing up and becoming king. To some degree, there's a clear kind of status implication in that Denethor doesn't think very highly of what has become to the former Númenóreans in the north. These bumpkins from out in the country, one of them is supposed to be in charge. But it's also clear that Denethor has come to enjoy his power rather a bit too much, and I think arrogance and pride, lead to his downfall. Now, in the films, this is transmuted into a strategic error where Denethor waits overlong to call Rohan for this reason. Whereas I should note, in the books, Denethor never quite lets this cloud his strategic judgment. He lights the beacons early, and he calls Rohan early. He does not wait. The beacons, Gandalf and Pippin are seeing the beacons light as they are galloping into Gondor 2 days before the Witch King has even set foot forward out of his offensive position. So some good military intelligence there. Good intel work when you know the enemy's offensive is going to step off before it does.
Mm-hmm.
Though presumably the preparations in Ithilien could not have been easy to disguise, right? Faramir must have been seeing troops and supplies moved into position. We see him through Frodo's eyes ambushing one of those convoys. So they must have had a good sense of what was about to happen. And so Denethor does not wait. Nevertheless, he doesn't, again, it's a moral rather than strategic failing that I think had Denethor put a little more faith in the prophecy, and Tolkien is very Catholic, in the essentially divine deliverance that was promised, that this wizard angel is in his court openly promising to his face, though Gandalf phrases it in words that Denethor does not want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
He might have spared himself quite a lot of grief and maybe lived to see the end credits.
Okay, so there's two things we might talk about. Well, I think we should talk about them both. I'm just wondering which to do first. Should we talk about how Rohan gets to Gondor and arrives on the battlefield first, or shall we talk about how the Witch King actually delivers the siege? Which do you want to do first?
I think we should do the siege first, because it's going to explain some of the positioning for Rohan. because I suppose I'll spoil this. Well, Peter Jackson regularly, in sort of trying to construct the filmic language and getting it to look cool, loses track of where things are. Tolkien never does. You can, and indeed I do, go through in minute detail as to where things are on the field, and it all fits really quite impressively. So, the Witch King, he breaches the Ramos Ekor. His problem now is Minas Tirith. And in some ways, in stark contrast to the fairly crude ladders and blasting charges effort of Saruman, the Witch King has planned. He has scoped out the defenses, and he has prepared specifically for these defenses. And the books describe sort of the day is spent setting up for the attack, which then happens at nightfall. And there are some wonderful sort of bits in Tolkien's narrative that both evoke, I think, his experience in World War I, but that are also really quite good. So, for instance, Tolkien describes the steady forward digging of trenches, which is something that late in the First World War you would absolutely do. You would move your trench works forward in preparation for an attack. You would sometimes secretly dig out trenches snaking towards the enemy lines so that you could at least start midway through no man's land.
Right.
And we get this description, and the trenches are zigzag, which is something that you absolutely do in the First World War. You can look at aerial photography of the trenches. You zigzag them so that someone can't shoot down your trench line and hit all of your guys at once.
Right.
On the flip side, he also knows what ditches are for in pre-modern warfare. No one on an ancient battlefield, you don't get in the trench. That's not what it's for. The trench is to foul an enemy attack. And so what the Witch King is doing with these trench works is he's hemming the defenders in so that they cannot sally out and attack the things he's building, siege towers, catapults, the rams, and so on, because these trenches are then filled with stakes and then lit on fire for sort of extra effect. I don't know if anyone... fire trenches is not a tactic I'm familiar with in the Mediterranean. There's more use of incendiaries in warfare in East Asia, as I understand it. So perhaps there's something there that I don't know about.
Well, it's very difficult to attack when, you don't just have to climb into the trench and out the other side, but when you're going to catch fire in the process of doing it, yeah.
But the idea of we're going to dig a trench in front of our siege works, and then we're going to fill it with sharpened sticks, that's standard. That's straight out of the Roman siege playbook. They do it all the time. If you go to Alesia in France, they've restored some of the works, and you can see what they would have looked like. And it involves a lot of sharp sticks that an attacker would have to navigate, of course, while you're shooting arrows and throwing javelins at them and so on. It'd be very bad. And of course, Gondor makes no effort to charge these defenses. It would be stupid. And so then he's got siege towers, he has catapults, and then, of course, he's going to bring up the ram. And one of the things I like about this, a lot of fiction about pre-modern sieges is very focused on siege towers. They're very flashy. And the siege towers are mostly about dropping some sort of big drawbridge. The film does this and charging onto the walls. Siege towers could do this, but it was not their primary purpose. The main purpose of a siege tower was not to capture the walls, but to clear the walls. You'd roll it up and you could shoot arrows and throw javelins from your siege tower, which is taller than the walls, and you could force enemies off of the walls. Which is very important for you then to either do something like build a ramp up the wall to scale them, or take a ram up to the wall to bash the gate or the wall down, or otherwise breach the city. And so the tower's purpose was to clear away the defenders so that you could make some other kind of breach. And the same was often true of catapults. Particularly in the ancient world, using catapults to smash your way straight through a wall designed to resist them wasn't practical. But what you could use catapults to do is you could use them to smash up. If you look at the top of a wall, they have that tooth pattern of stonework. It's called crenellation, which is designed to create really good cover for soldiers on the wall. They can hide behind the stone and fire out from the gaps. Well, what you can do with your catapults, you can't smash the wall, but you can definitely smash up those crenellations. And you can hit defenders on the wall. And if you can generate enough fire between catapults and potentially archers and coming down from your towers on these walls, you can clear them. And Tolkien describes this, that at one point that there are orcs essentially on foot at the base of the wall, he says sort of many targets fit for archers of the sort that Gondor had once boasted, but there simply aren't enough soldiers left on the wall to do anything about it. That the defenses have been overawed in this way. And of course, the other component to that that's getting used is fire. That the Witch King is using his artillery to set fire to the lower reaches of the city to cut the outer wall off from the defenders, which is also trying to light your enemy's stuff on fire. Ancient cities are really combustible. Incendiary ammunition, whether it's from catapults or from bows, or even the Romans had an incendiary javelin.
What? Sorry. I've never heard of that before. Could you just say something about that?
Yes. So there are a couple of different forms of the Roman javelin, the pilum, and one of them that we do find has a little kind of diamond-shaped socket just below the point where you would take, presumably probably a rag, probably a bit of textile soaked in oil. You would tie it in there and you'd light it on fire, and you could then throw the javelin at something to light it on fire. So an incendiary javelin, a sort of a slightly larger version of how you would make a fire arrow. And now in movies, they always deploy fire arrows in battle. They're always shooting them at people. This is pointless. You're not going to light a person on fire that way. People are 70% water, which does not burn. And also, I mean, if you get hit by a fire arrow, you're just going to pull it out, right? You're not going to leave it in there for like the 5 minutes it's going to take for your clothes to catch fire. That's not its purpose. That said, right, these incendiary munitions, again, catapults, arrows, javelins, all this stuff, they exist. What were they for? They were for lighting defenses on fire. That if you're facing a wooden wall or a city with lots of thatch-covered roofs, if you just keep shooting things that are on fire into that city, into that fort, the chance that any individual fire arrow is going to catch a roof on fire is very low. But if you're flinging dozens of them, one of them's going to, and then the whole place is going to go up. And that's going to be an enormous problem to the defenders, who are going to have to try to put those fires out. It's going to cut them off from areas of their defenses, and they're going to have to spend manpower putting the fires out, which is manpower that isn't opposing your breach effort. And so lighting the lower reaches of the city on fire as a way of clearing the wall, yes, this is absolutely something that an attacker would do. And we have recovered archaeologically. I discussed some of them in my dissertation. We have recovered archaeologically arrows and javelins that clearly do. They have little sockets just below the point. The sort of arrowhead splits into a little hollow diamond shape, so that you could tie a rag that's been soaked in flammables there for the purpose of doing this kind of thing. And so, yeah, not useful in battle, but very useful in sieges. And so, of course, all of this, and I do kind of love it about this, Tolkien is very clear about this. Everything the Witch King is doing is meant to disperse the defenders between many different threats, to distract them and deplete them for the ram effort, for the effort on the gate, which is his main effort and was always the main plan. It isn't something that in the movie, they resort to using Grond because other rams won't work. Whereas in the books, right, like Grond has been purpose-built for this specific gate. What it reminds me of, in the First World War in Belgium in 1914, the very beginning of the war, one of the German problems, right, they want to do this big right flank attack around the French and British armies, which ends up sort of working and then not working, right, the Schlieffen Plan.
Yeah.
And that means they have to send most of their army through Belgium, through a relatively narrow area. And the Belgians weren't stupid. They could see this corridor, and the corridor had to move through the railroad junction at Liège. And they knew this, and so they had built a huge fortress complex around Liège, and they had garrisoned it quite capably. And of course, the Germans then, in the decades leading up to the war, are aware of this fortress complex and had spied it out quite completely, and had purpose-built artillery pieces to destroy each part of the fortress. Oh, this bunker is rated to resist a 10-inch shell. Okay, we're going to build some 11-inch diameter artillery pieces that will punch through it. And so when the fighting begins, they show up. There's some initial friction in the effort, but eventually they roll up their purpose-built artillery pieces and they reduce the forts one by one because they have purpose-built their weapons to these static defenses. The fellow who is coordinating all of this is the soon-to-be Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, who will be running the war by the end of it. And so this is his first debut in the First World War, famously on a I don't know if it's famous. It's famous to me. He's bicycling between these various units, coordinating them.
Interesting.
But it seems somewhat similar that, the Witch King is shown up with a ram purpose-made for this gate in particular, because they knew it was a really well-reinforced gate, and so they're prepared. And so the plan was always to apply this ram. Grand doesn't have any other job. And so his having delivered the siege, his goal is to spread the defenders out so that he can apply this piece of force on the gate right then. And up until that moment, when the gate cracks open, everything is going to plan for the Witch King, right? Everything has worked out, and he rolls up on the gate, and Gandalf, this is a scene that I think is done actually terribly in the movie because they break it. Gandalf tells him to go away, and if you're the Witch King in that moment, you've got to be feeling pretty good about what's been going on. Your plan is carried off pretty well, and of course, everything from this point is going to go wrong for you. But you don't know that yet, because of course, it's literally as he is getting ready to triumphantly march through this shattered gate and tell Gandalf off personally that he hears the horn calls that Rohan has showed up in his rear, and he hasn't been told about it. And I guess that's a good segue, I suppose, into what's going on with Rohan.
So I was quite interested. I think you make the point in your blog post that the time that Rohan takes to get to Gondor is not unreasonable, but you make the point about spare horses. So do you want to just say a bit about how sort of horse armies would actually move in ancient times?
Right, with lots of horses. So in movies, you always see, right, the knight is on his war horse. Yeah. So it's a lot more horses. For any cavalryman in an army, it's usually safe to assume at least 3 horses. The horse he rides to the battle on, the horse he fights on, and a spare. When you're talking about knights, and now you get into sticky arguments about whether the Rohirrim are like actual knights, but of course the knight has his entourage with him. They all need horses and spares. And so, for instance, we get the description. It's a somewhat fantastical description, but it's a description of what would essentially have been a sort of a minor baron going to war. And his personal party, not including the troops of his vassals, his household group includes 50 people and 95 horses.
Gosh.
It's counted out for us. And so, it would have been pretty nuts. Moving to the sort of crazy town levels of nomadic horsemen, a Mongol warrior rides to war with 5 horses, at least, per warrior. So if you have 10,000 Mongols coming over the hill, they're coming over the hill with 50,000 horses. So Rohan's roughly 10,000 Rohirrim that show up this battle are probably have 30, 40,000 horses in tow. With their army carrying their supplies. You don't want to ride your warhorse to the battle. Your warhorse is a specially bred animal for that purpose. You don't want to wear it out, but it's also, it's big and heavy. It's not a pack horse. It's particularly bred to be fast and powerful and combative. So you're going to have a riding horse, and then you're going to have your charger, and then you probably have another horse that's carrying all of your stuff. Because the riding horse is carrying you, and the war horse is being specifically spared for all of this. And now if you have all of these horses and everybody is mounted armies can move pretty fast. Especially what you can do is you have all of these horses. While you're moving, you can be shifting across these horses if you have more than just the requisite number. So you can keep, because riding on the back of a horse, the horse has to carry your weight. It tires the horse out fairly quickly. But if you can shift between horses, you can maintain this moving speed. And so fast-moving, forced march infantry generally caps out around 20 miles or so, 20, 25 miles a day. Cavalry, agrarian cavalry, with 3 to 4 horses per cavalryman can get up to around 40, 45 miles per day. And then steppe nomads, the Mongols can move in excess of 60 miles a day, which is just absolutely blistering by ancient standards, and routinely Chinggis Khan and his successors use this to just show up in places where there's, you're supposed to be 500 miles away and then you're just there because you can move faster. And crucially, and this matters for this battle, at that 40, 50 miles a day, you're moving faster than the rumor of your coming.
Yeah.
Because the people whispering, I saw an army go through, that's moving at foot speed. That's moving at 20 miles a day. And so in some ways, it's sort of the ancient version of being supersonic. You're moving faster than the sound. And so what Theoden is able to do, and this is, I think, an example of Theoden being a quite masterful commander. He comes down the road. His scouts indicate to him, there is an orc army strung across the road in front of us designed to block us from ever getting into Gondor. And they've strewn the road they've dug ditches and filled them with spikes, which is A+ anti-cavalry tactics from the ancient world. Talk to my buddy Roll on Twitter about the importance of ditches in warfare. When in doubt, dig more ditches. But what Theoden is able to do is that there's a local sort of tribe of basically mountain peoples. He's able to contact them. They have somewhat friendly relations. And so he's able to arrange a guide because the orcs are causing these guys trouble. And so he is able to then move his army through some forest and mountain paths to circumvent this orc army. Now, presumably, the orc army is attempting to send word back to Gondor back to the Witch King that we've spotted an enemy force, but that's going to be moving at 20 miles a day. Theoden's moving at 40 miles a day. So he is outrunning the news of his coming. And then he then reaches the Ramis Ekor, this wall, and the Witch King has left a small blocking force here, but the orcs are so busy bashing up the wall and looting the place that they aren't in combat formation. And so the first wave of the Rohirrim just instantly scatters them. The screening force for the Rohirrim scatters them. And this is, for me at least, perfectly believable thing to go wrong in a campaign that you tell those guys to keep watch, but they instead loot. Endless problems with ancient armies where the soldiers go off to loot when they need to be doing something else. Where situations where this happens at Magnesia. The Seleucid is a Seleucid army against a Roman army. The Seleucid cavalry, victorious on the right side of the battlefield, charges off the battlefield to go loot the Roman camp and only realizes later that the rest of their army has lost and they have lost the battle.
Yeah, they have. The Greeks did keep losing against the Romans, and somebody made the point, the Greeks keep beating the Persians and the Persians keep beating the Romans. Yeah,
no, there's an odd sort of, it's, although to be fair, I mean, the Parthians have a pretty good record against Macedonian armies too. So the Persian Empire is, of course, defeated by Alexander, and then Seleucus walks away with the largest chunk of it. His successors struggle to control what is today Iran, which eventually splits off under the Parthian dynasty. And the Parthians are able to hold their own against the Seleucids pretty well. So it isn't just the Romans that have trouble with the Parthians. Even the Greek speakers did too. Part of this is that the Parthian army has incorporated some elements of the Macedonians. We're told by our ancient sources that they have Macedonian-style pike troops as well in their army. And they use this against the Romans. I'm getting a little off topic, but whatever, it's fun. They use it against the Romans at Carrhae to alternately press Roman forces with pike troops. When the Romans try and clump up into the testudo, their anti-arrow formation, the Parthians will send their heavy cavalry and their pike troops forward. So the Romans have to lay out back into battle formation, and then they'll back those troops up and go back to shooting them with arrows over again.
You mentioned heavy cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never understood really the difference between light cavalry and heavy cavalry, and which are the forces of Rohan, and what's the difference?
Right. Rohan is heavy cav, for sure. So we want to think about cavalry really on kind of two axes. What is their primary weapon axis, and then how armored are they, which is your heavy versus light. And generally speaking, functionally, in the pre-modern world, you have three kinds of weapons that you use on horseback often. I suppose four if we move into the ancient world and we get javelin, skirmish cavalry, but we'll put them to the side for a second. Sorry to the Numidians. You can use a bow, horse archers. You can use a lance or a spear, some kind of spear from horseback, which we call lancer cavalry. And then the weird in-between zone is saber cavalry, which we can get to. Now, the guys with bows and the guys with lances often have swords as backup weapons. We really talk about saber cavalry. We mean cavalry that has a sword as a primary weapon. And then those guys can either be armored or not. Generally, horse archers tend to be light cavalry, although armored Mongol horse archers are a thing. Armored Sassanid horse archers are a thing. So horse archer heavy cav is a thing that exists, although it's rare. And so the question is armor, right? Are you armoring the horse and are you armoring the man on the horse? The more armor you're putting on the individual, the slower the horse is obviously going to move. And indeed, you're going to need different horses. A steppe pony is going to struggle to support a man armored in, say, full plate. Mm-hmm. It's just not that big of a horse. And so this sort of dichotomy develops where you have heavy lancer cavalry. These are your knights. Armored man, typically on an armored horse. His primary weapon is usually a lance, and you'll have a backup axe, sword, something. And that's your heavy cavalry. And then the other kind, you have your light horse archer cavalry, your Mongols. And then light cavalry in the middle is your unarmored lancer or saber-carrying fellow without bows and arrows. I will say, generally, there are some advantages to heavy cavalry over horse archer cavalry. There are, frankly, no advantages to light cavalry, light lancer cavalry over horse archers. If you have horse archers, you don't need to use light cav. Where you see light cavalry really emerging is as the cavalry of agrarian societies that don't produce horse archers. Horse archery is a really hard skill to train. One of my harumps with Tolkien is that he gives the Rohirrim some horse archers, but they don't really have the social structure to produce them. And so I don't think they should have any. And they don't fight like horse archers much in the event anyway. But generally speaking, for your society to produce good horse archers, that either needs to be your way of survival, as with steppe nomads, or something that your elite invest in extremely heavily. It needs to be core to their identities for generations if you're going to produce good horse archers. Many agrarian societies do this, but many agrarian societies don't. They don't do it well. And so if you are, for instance, say, the French, you don't produce good horse archers or any horse archers, but there is value for fast-moving cavalry that can screen and scout effectively. It's good for dispersing enemy skirmishers. You don't need a lot of armor if what you're charging at are just a handful of bowmen scattered across the terrain. Fast-moving, the mobility of this kind of light cavalry has its advantages. And so you might maintain some guys as light cavalry in addition to your heavy cavalry, which is your heavy cavalry is designed to do more impact. Obviously, if your light cavalry ends up in a close fight against your heavy cavalry, they're in a lot of trouble because they have the same weapons but no armor.
Right. And would it be fair to say then that the Romans, who had small cavalry detachments, these are light cavalry, right? Which are there to scout and to break up skirmishes, as you say.
Yeah, the Romans do eventually adopt some heavy cav. So by the Empire, and even in the late Republic, the Romans are working with a system where they have light cav, heavy cav, horse archers, because they're adopting into their military system the militaries of people they conquer. And so, for instance, the Numidians, I guess the Numidians are getting into this podcast, have really excellent skirmish cavalry, light skirmish cavalry. This is the cavalry that the Carthaginians are repeatedly using to punk the Romans is mostly Numidian. And so when the Romans defeat Carthage, they get Numidia as an ally, and we see Numidian cavalry showing up in other places. We see them, for instance, in Spain. The Romans also recognize that Gallic aristocrats make pretty good heavy cavalry, that it's you're talking a fairly wealthy Gaul. He's on a horse. He's got a spear, a decently chunky shield. He has chainmail armor and a nice helmet. He's fairly heavily armored by ancient standards. You get a bunch of these guys. You hit someone with them really hard. It works. Caesar loves his Gallic shock cavalry. He actually, when he's fighting in Gaul, he has no Roman cavalry because Roman cavalry is such intense rubbish. The Romans are very good at it. Roman cavalry is much lighter than this. And the Romans just aren't good at it. They don't have that intense cultural investment to produce good cavalry. And then the Romans eventually in the east, fighting the Seleucids and the Parthians, they encounter what are called cataphract cavalry. Cataphract, a Greek word meaning fully enclosed. An armored man on an armored horse. The Gauls don't armor their horses. This sort of super heavy cavalry, and the Romans are like, I'll take some of that too. And so they do that.
Let's talk about something which I think is dear to your heart, and it's something I struggle with a little bit, and I'd like to push you a little bit on some of it. But what does a cavalry charge look like? Because at the end of that's the moment the books have been leading up to the big charge.
Right, and it's just the best scene in the movie, even though the movie does not quite get the mechanics of a cavalry charge right. I mean, so I should note one of the things about cavalry dynamics is that, of course, cavalry was falling out of use as we enter the age of film, and so there are a lot of questions about what does a cavalry charge against a body of resisting infantry look like, which we cannot answer because, of course, we never filmed it. We have descriptions of it. We have art of it. And there have actually been efforts by historians to look at instances of police cavalry, mostly in the UK, charging protesters.
Yeah.
I actually, when I do my military history survey at UNC, I actually use some footage of the Trafalgar Square poll tax riots under Thatcher.
Yeah.
And the police cavalry charges in to see how the horses and show my students how the horses and the people interact. So there's been a lot of theorizing on this topic. Movies like to show huge, densely packed, solid masses of deep cavalry just sort of steamrollering over infantry. This does not work for a number of reasons. First, horses aren't stupid. They generally won't charge into solid objects. And a mass of infantry that isn't going anywhere looks to a horse like a solid object. It will stop, generally. If it doesn't stop, and this does happen, we have this at Agincourt, some of the French knights just plow straight into the English formation. What happens is they promptly died. Because you're now surrounded by enemies who are more mobile than you on foot. They're completely around you. You can't go anywhere. And they have lots of weapons. And they're attacking you from all angles, and you just die. That's unfortunate for you.
But here's where I want to sort of push back on you a little bit, because as I understand it, you kind of ride up. You don't want to waste your horses, right? So
right.
you start off at a trot, and then you move to whatever it is that's next, which I think is a gallop, but never quite sure with horses.
Trot to a canter to a gallop.
Yeah, right. Trot to a canter to a gallop. So now everything's galloping. You've got sort of, I don't know how deep your ranks are, but say there's 3 or 4 horses directly behind you. There's horses on all sides of you. And
Probably not.
Which bit? Probably not.
Probably not deep. So this is the first thing that we start to look at how movies do it wrong, is the formation you're moving forward. Your formation can be deep or it can be tight, but it will not be both.
Right. And I think the idea of it being tight is interesting to me as well, because I'm thinking, well, what happens when you come to a tree or a boulder? If you're literally kneecap to kneecap, what the heck happens in that situation? But let's assume.
And the answer is you don't want to use your cavalry there. If there are lots of trees and boulders, be somewhere else. Though, again, if there's no one directly behind you and you realize that your kneecap to kneecap position is going to carry you into a tree, what you can do is slow down.
But let's supposing you're too deep then, right? Which is not so deep. And I don't know what they were with the charge of the Light Brigade and so on.
Too deep, but with an interval. There's going to be an interval between the two so that slowing can happen. So you're not going to be horse snout to butt. There's going to be a space.
There's going to be a space, right? Which makes perfect sense. Okay, but you're now at full tilt. And there's noise and there's everything going on around you. You say that the horse won't do it because it's not stupid. But at some stage, it's got no choice because its sheer momentum, surely, is going to take it through. It can't stop, can it?
It can rear. So, we have plenty of descriptions of this happening, and we can see this happening, that if a horse thinks, like, when it realizes that it is its last moment to stop before hitting a solid object, some horses and war horses are trained for aggressiveness. Some horses will plow straight in. Again, we hear about this at Agincourt. But some horses will stop. They will rear up on their hind legs and skid to a halt. They're rearing up, as a side note, to control their center of balance to avoid toppling forward. The problem is this is going to bring them to a dead stop in spear's reach of the formation, which promptly results in you dying. Horses don't really understand infantry tactics very well.
So let me just ask them, because Alexander famously, I can't remember, he's got something like 50,000 cavalry.
Yep.
And that's his primary striking arm, I think. He always seems to start off with a cavalry charge.
He starts off by pinning the enemy with his infantry and then delivers the cavalry charge.
Right. So how can his horses, I mean, presumably the Persians, they've been fighting wars for a long time. How can they be discomfited by a cavalry charge if at the end of the day the cavalry charge can't press home?
So it can potentially press home. What a cavalry charge cannot do is slam into a solid, unbroken mass of men. But if there is a gap, you can drive through it. If they're spread thin, a skilled cavalryman can gallop through the gaps, zigzagging his way through, stabbing as he goes. It's devastating. If they're running away, you can ride them down. And so for cavalry, in some ways, the question of does your cavalry charge work against infantry, in some ways, the answer to that question is out of your hands. If the infantry responds correctly, you will have to veer off and try again. But horses are big and scary and loud, and so keeping in that nice, dense, clean formation while the horses come at you is very difficult mentally. If you're not trained for that, you won't do it. Moreover, trying to keep that clean human wall formation when part of your army is engaged with Alexander's infantry and part of your army is getting skirmished because his cavalry was always at the join, right? To the right of his cavalry will be his light skirmish infantry. To the left of his cavalry are his elite hypaspists. To their left is the main phalanx. And so he's relying on the fact that the army if he's looking forward, the enemy to his left has just hit the Macedonian infantry, has come to a screeching halt. The force to the right of that is still moving forward, but is being skirmished and broken up, and that creates a gap that he can drive his cavalry through. And now he's not hitting a solid wall of enemies. Now he is punching through a gap where he can, his cavalryman, Alexander deploys his cavalry in a wedge, probably looser than the medieval thigh-to-thigh formation. The Macedonian wedge is probably looser to allow some maneuvering. But it's a wedge. So the first guy through, which is Alexander, it's always Alexander, it's always the first guy through.
Yes, it's always Alexander.
And then as you're going through, right, you're swiping at the guys next to you. They're running away from you. The infantry is running to get away from your wedge of pointy, sharp, fast-moving objects. You're then widening the gap as your cavalry gets through into the rear and running down anyone who runs away. This can work, but of course it does require the infantry to run away. The good news for a cavalryman, untrained infantry will always run away, and poorly trained infantry will generally run away. And so this can work for you. Theoden's big advantage for his charge, which again is rather more sensibly delivered in the books, is that he's charging into the back of an army that doesn't know he's coming. In the film, the orcs see Theoden and array against him. And then he does his big charge. In the books, he's cleared away those scout forces on the wall. And again, he's moved faster than the report of his coming. So the first the orcs know he's coming is when those horns sound. And that's the charge call. So the first they know he's coming is on the shift from canter to gallop, maybe 15 seconds before he hits the back of their forces. They scatter, they break. There is no organized opposition to him. He achieves this sort of pitch-perfect flanking attack on what is essentially the northern flank and rear of the enemy if you look at where he's going, and they just melt away and get trampled. And once the dense infantry formation breaks up, the mobility and the weight of the horse is dominant. A line of horses cannot trample a crowd. If they slam into a crowd, they'll crush the first few people, then the horses go down because horse legs are very fragile things. And then the riders go down, and a whole lot of people are dead, which is not what you as the rider want because you're one of them. But if a horse collides with one person, it just knocks them down and tramples them and keeps going. And this is actually what I show my students in what is honestly somewhat I have a content warning on this lecture, but somewhat graphic footage of one protester being ridden down and trampled. The protester survives, was badly injured, being trampled by police horses because everybody else cleared out of the way. The crowd just naturally parts away from the horses, and then there's the one person that can't get away fast enough and gets hit.
Yeah.
And of course, how much worse if the guys on the horses have long spears that can reach out around them. And podcasting is a very visual medium, so I'm making stabbing gestures, which no one can see except my cat. Right, and that's devastating. And so, if the infantry holds together, it will hold. But holding the infantry together is very hard. It's clear that unlike Saruman, the Witch King had a plan for holding his infantry together. He was going to have ditches. They were going to be filled with stakes. That's a good plan. It works great for the English. It works great for the Flemish against French cavalry when you can get it. It works for the Scots against English cavalry. But he gets caught by a cavalry force he doesn't know is coming because his scouts haven't told them it is, and his blocking force botched their job.
Okay. Gosh, we've been going on. We've been
going on and on and on.
But it's great. It's great. It's been, I'm finding it very interesting anyway. Can I ask you, one of the things that I disliked most about the film, in fact, it really had me almost leaving the cinema, I was so upset about it, was the Army of the Dead. Because in the books, they clear out the force down in the south, and they allow Aragon to come up with the men who have been blocked. But in the film, they turn up and they enter Minas Tirith and they destroy the Witch King's army. At which point you think nothing anybody did mattered.
At all.
Not in the slightest. You should have just let the Army of the Dead do it. And then, you would have saved yourselves an awful lot of bother. I
get into this in the last post in some frustration that I thought this gets into the question of morale too. That Tolkien, I think, with a greater sense of how battles work, has very sensibly, the Siege of Gondor is all about morale, and he has a keen attention to how the arrival of each force in each event shifts morale, and armies quail and retreat, and then they reform and attack again, and so on. And what delivers the sort of the killing blow is not that Aragorn shows up with the ancient equivalent of nuclear weapons in the form of the unstoppable army of the dead, but simply that this last reinforcing force turns out to be full of enemy soldiers. It's not even that the Witch King's army is defeated or exhausted. It's demoralized.
Yeah.
At that point, they run. And this cuts to one of the most important things about warfare in all periods. You do not win the battle by killing all of the enemies. Almost no army ever wins this way. You win the battle by making the enemy run away, and you win the war by convincing the enemy not to fight anymore. And this is something that is so wrong in much contemporary strategic and political thinking, when they fail to think about end states. And you have to ask yourself, how are you going to incentivize an enemy to stop fighting? Right? What is your end state? Peter Jackson in the movie, instead of Tolkien's sort of very brilliant, the battle expressed in terms of shifting morale, Peter Jackson sees it as a contest of weapon systems, which I think is such a modern way of viewing things, that it's who has the biggest cannon, right? And each side deploys fancier weapon systems until finally the Army of the Dead is the ultimate trump card. And that's not how battles work. Anyone looking at the last 20 years of American military history, and for that matter, British military history, can observe that having the fanciest weapons does not win the war. Right? I mean, from the beginning to the present, U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan have always had the fanciest weapons and the best trained soldiers. And last I checked, we're concluding a peace treaty, which quite frankly is very advantageous to the Taliban. Mm. And one might question if we won. I don't want to open that political can of worms, but just to say, clearly all the fancy kit, as much as it helps, doesn't win the battle. What won the battle was morale. Our determination ran out before theirs did. And so I think Tolkien is really onto something, and I think you're right that bringing the Army of the Dead to Minas Tirith really is one of the places where I think Peter Jackson is generally, I think his adaptation is very good.
Yes.
I think it's a place where he's done a real disservice to to the original source material and to its sense of how battles work, and also just generally to the men of Gondor whose stubborn resistance. Theoden's knights are at least aristocrats, but you get this passage in The Lord of the Rings, which again doesn't show up in the movies, where the various contingents from Gondor are arriving in Minas Tirith before the battle, whatever they can send.
Yes.
And these are common fellows being led by local leaders. I mean, we talk about, the fisher folk from here, and the tradesmen from there, and the farmers from there. And the only really fancy pants aristocratic bunch are the Knights of Dol Amroth. It's the one pack of aristocrats. Gondor's army is an army of common men who resist stubbornly, who fight almost entirely on foot. They're mostly infantrymen. And in the end, I mean, with a little help from their friends, win the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of that is lost in Peter Jackson's focus on weapon systems over men and morale.
I agree with you. I think the adaptations are actually pretty wonderful, but I think there is just something about a film that has its own limitations, and there's maybe not a great deal that even the best director can do about it, whereas Tolkien can move from one part of the story to another part of the story, sort of concealing information. You're not quite sure what's happening in another part of the field, and he can build suspense until he just lets it go. It's much harder to do that, I think, in a film where you've got so many different storylines.
Well, and film has to be so condensed and so visual, and it can be sometimes, I think, hard to capture the nuances of the book in a visual medium where events that could, spread out over 30 pages in the book need to happen in a minute and 30 seconds on the screen because, even these movies, which are very long, are not actually that long. And so everything has to be very compressed and very economical, and every scene has to be doing many things at once. I think Peter Jackson's adaptation is brilliant, even if he does occasionally fall short of his source material.
Yeah, maybe he should have made it a Netflix series or something.
Well, I mean, Amazon is doing that, I think.
Oh, really?
I think so.
That's pretty brave. Okay, well, let's. Is there anything particularly you want to say, or shall we just about leave it there? Because there's just one other question I had for you, but it's not about the military history. So I just wondered if there was anything that you felt we'd missed out that you wanted to sort of mention now.
No, I mean, I think we've done pretty well. Again, I think I would stress again that the core lesson at the end of the Siege of Gondor series, which, I mean, both of these series were about teaching military history concepts through the fiction that we all know, is to again hammer that idea that the determinant element in battle is not necessarily weapons or technology. I mean, it is possible to get a technological sheer so vast that nothing else matters. The European conquest of the New World being sort of the obvious thing to point to.
Sure.
But by and large, where technology is even remotely close to parity, it is not the technology or the weapons or even necessarily the genius considerations of generals, but human psychology that determines who wins and loses in war. And I think particularly some professional military historians and many, many amateurs who are interested in military history, tend to be kind of gearheads. And, counting the number of rivets on this plane and the number of shells that this gun can fire at this range and so on. And often in the end, that is not what decides the battle. It is the mind of the humans who are working those weapons that decides the battle. And so, I think that people who are interested in that kind of stuff would be a little bit more served to think about that, think about the experience and the minds of the people in these battles, as opposed to just the weapons and the equipment.
That's actually makes me think about things like a general like Julius Caesar, who, you don't hear about any amazing, tactical innovations, but his men go into battle knowing they're going to win and determined to win, and they don't stop until they have won. And I think, that does speak to the psychology of what Caesar's able to deliver.
Oh, clearly he's fantastically charismatic, and his soldiers are very committed to him, and he seems to be very committed to his soldiers, right? I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, he's able to foster, to bring back this term from the last time, a level of cohesion among his force to the point where veterans of Julius Caesar's campaigns, even after his death, are essentially the key military commodity that Lepidus and Antony and Octavian and the rest are bickering over because these formations that he's cemented so well are so cemented and often so loyal to his memory. Famously, Octavian is able to get the legions of one of his rivals, Lepidus, who's filled with Caesarian veterans, to defect by walking unarmed into their camp and just declaring accurately, Gaius Julius Caesar sum, I am Gaius Julius Caesar, which by adoption was his name. And he's just like, I'm Julius Caesar, follow me. And they did.
And they did, yeah. Okay, let's leave it there. And so, Bret Devereaux, thank you so much for your time today. That was great fun.
Thank you for having me. This was a ton of fun.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media, and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.